Imagine a lie detector so powerful it could read your innermost thoughts. I mean, a machine that knows your true feelings about sensitive topics, even the ones you might hide from yourself. Okay, now what if I told you that machine was a complete fake, but it still worked? It sounds crazy, right? Well, let's dive into the story of the Bogus Pipeline, one of psychology's most clever and definitely most controversial tools for getting to the real truth.
So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the basic problem with honesty, then look at this bogus pipeline solution. From there, we'll get into the ethical minefield it created, see how this deception was kind of put on trial, find out what people really thought about it, and finally, what this all tells us about the price of truth.
All right, so to really get why anyone would invent a fake lie detector, you first have to understand a massive problem in social science: people lie. Not, always maliciously. A lot of the time, it's just to present ourselves in a better light. It's a deeply human thing to want to be seen as a good, responsible, and tolerant person. I mean, think about it for a second. Have you ever been filling out a survey and it asks about your recycling habits or how often you donate to charity or your views on some touchy social issue? What's your first instinct? Is it to give the 100% brutally honest truth or the answer that makes you sound like a pretty good person? That little fudge factor right there, that is exactly what researchers are up against. This whole phenomenon has a name, of course. It's called social desirability bias, and it completely contaminates data on all sorts of critical topics. People might overreport how positive they feel about minority groups, even if they hold private prejudices, or they might underreport things like smoking or drug use. Now, for scientists trying to figure out how society actually works, this isn't just some minor inconvenience, it's a massive barrier to the truth. It can lead to totally flawed public health policies, a complete misunderstanding of social issues, and a skewed picture of what people really think and do behind closed doors. So, facing this exact problem back in the early 1970s, which was a pretty wild and experimental time for psychology, by the way, two researchers, Jones and Segal, they came up with a radical solution. Their thinking was, if they couldn't count on people to choose to be honest, well, maybe they could convince them they had no choice at all.
And that solution was the Bogus Pipeline, or BPL for short. The idea was actually pretty simple, but the execution was brilliant. They decided to create a machine that looked like an infallible, almost psychic lie detector, and then just convince people it worked. The machine itself was a total prop, just a theatrical mess of wires, intimidating dials, and electrodes. But its effect on honesty? Oh, that was very, very real.
So here's how they actually pulled it off. First, a participant gets hooked up to this super intimidating machine, setting a serious high-tech mood. Then comes the really clever part, the proof. The experimenter would ask a few questions they secretly already knew the answers to, maybe from an earlier survey. And, surprise, surprise, the machine would correctly identify the person's true attitudes. Once the participant was totally convinced the machine was legit, the real survey would begin. The psychological trap was set. I mean, why would you lie if you think you're just going to get caught anyway? Jones and Segal themselves called their invention a pipeline to the soul. And that phrase, man, it just perfectly captures the ambition and maybe a little bit of the arrogance of the whole project. They really believed they hadn't just built a better survey tool, they thought they'd created a direct line into a person's raw, unvarnished inner world. And for a while, it seemed to work. They got more honest answers on everything from racial prejudice to smoking. It was a breakthrough for sure. But it came with this growing, nagging question. Was it right? And this, right here, brings us to the heart of the conflict. The bogus pipeline might have been effective, yeah, but it was built on a foundation of pure deception. And this kicked off a fierce ethical debate among psychologists that went on for decades. Let's just break down the two sides. On one side, you had the critics. They said that actively lying to people who are volunteering for your study is just fundamentally wrong no matter what you find out. It violates that sacred trust, and it could cause real psychological harm by forcing people to admit to things that are super stressful or damaging to their self-esteem. But on the other side, you had the defenders. They argued that the benefits, getting real valid data on huge social issues like racism or public health, outweighed the ethical costs of what they saw as a harmless deception. They'd even argue it was morally costly not to study these topics with the best tools you have. So for almost 30 years, this whole debate was basically just philosophical. It was experts arguing with other experts. Nobody had actually bothered to ask the research subjects themselves, the people at the center of all this, what they thought. That is, until 2001. That's when two researchers, Herman Aguinas and Christine Henley, decided to put the ethics of the bogus pipeline to a real empirical test. But right away, they ran into this fascinating kind of meta problem. How do you ethically study whether method is unethical? I mean, they couldn't just hook a new group of people up to the bogus pipeline and then ask them if they felt it was unethical. That would just be repeating the very problem they were trying to solve.
Their solution was just as clever as the original BPL itself. They got 180 undergraduate students, the exact kind of people who would be in these studies, and instead of using the machine on them, they just had them read a detailed summary of a real study that had used the bogus pipeline. The topics are all over the map, from racial attitudes to helping a stranger to a really tricky one about cigarette smoking in children. Then, from a safe, informed distance, they basically asked the students to act as judge and jury.
So, after all those decades of experts arguing, what did the actual potential participants think? Well, the results were probably not what a lot of the critics were expecting. First up, the downsides. The students definitely agreed that being in a BPL study would be more uncomfortable than a regular survey. You can see the discomfort rating jumped up pretty significantly. So yes, there was a perceived psychological cost to the deception. People knew it would be more stressful. But was that the end of the story? Not even close. Get this. Despite acknowledging the discomfort, a whopping 72% of the students believed the research should have been conducted. They saw the cost, but they still endorsed the mission.
And when you look at their other ratings, you can really see why. The students rated the research topics as highly important, a 5.34 out of 7. They also thought the bogus pipeline was a really effective tool for getting at the truth, rating it a 5.41. And crucially, they felt that the benefits ultimately outweighed the costs. The verdict from the people who would actually be in the hot seat was pretty clear. The deception was worth it.
So, the data seemed to pretty much settle the debate. The very people that all these ethical guidelines are meant to protect saw the bogus pipeline as a justifiable tool for important research. But the study also uncovered one very important red line, a boundary that you probably shouldn't cross.
And that red line appeared when kids were involved. When the students looked at the BPL study on smoking in 13 and 14-year-olds, their ratings changed a lot. They saw the procedure as way more uncomfortable, distressing, and annoying when it was used on minors. The whole ethical math just shifted. Deceiving a consenting adult for science? Okay, that seemed like an acceptable trade-off. But subjecting children, a vulnerable group who can't really give the same kind of informed consent, to that same pressure, that clearly crossed the line for them. So in the end, the researchers concluded that, with the really significant exception of using it on kids, the people who would actually be in these experiments pretty much saw the bogus pipeline as both useful and ethical. Their data gave this powerful, real-world answer to decades of philosophical debate, suggesting that the people being deceived were often actually willing partners in this messy, complicated search for truth.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question that goes way beyond a psychology lab. The story of the bogus pipeline forces all of us to confront a pretty fundamental dilemma. In our quest for knowledge and understanding, when, if ever, is it okay to lie for the sake of uncovering a deeper truth?